Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Jessamyn Abel. I'm coming to you from the middle of Pennsylvania, at Penn State University, where I am a historian of Japan.
And it's one of those college towns that really is a college town.
It really is,
There's
yes.
not a lot else,
No.
but the not a lot else is a lot.
It's a huge school,
Yeah.
so it's there's a lot going on actually for us
It,
for
it,
just a college town. There's a lot here.
it's amazing. It is I've been to lots of college towns in the Midwest, and it's the one that you feel is its own world in a good way, actually.
Indeed.
There's no real town-gown division in the sense that you get in a place like Champaign, for example.
Yeah, I do feel. I mean, there is always talk about bringing town and gown together, but so much of the town is intimately connected to the gown, so
Yeah, yeah.
that
Well,
that difference is not stark.
in all these college towns, the working class relies completely on the university.
Hmm.
They mightn't like it,
Yeah,
and vice versa.
and a lot
Anyway,
of people's kids go there, so
yes, absolutely, absolutely, and it's a great school, and it's one of the world centers for lots of things, including climatology,
indeed,
actually,
yep.
because it's a real pioneer in things like meteorology and
Hmm.
then climate science, right?
Hmm.
With lots of other distinguished domains. Anyway, again, that's not what we're here to talk about. But before we talk about your work, let me ask you what's currently going on for you, and it might be something related to your research or not, in terms of what's impeding, preoccupying, dynamizing, interesting you. What's happening for the prof?
Well, I think like many people who live in the United States right now, I've been thinking a lot about democracy, uh, the things that can bolster or threaten it, the things that transform it into one thing or another. And I am thinking about that, of course, because of the political goings-on here.
Mm.
But then I've connected it to work as I was finishing up my last book and trying to think about what I wanted to write on next. I was reading through some things, some documents that I had from the late 1940s, and I realized that I was seeing the word democracy a lot in places that I wasn't necessarily expecting. In this case, it was some training manuals for new employees at the Japanese National Railways. And I was surprised and a little curious about why they were talking about democracy in order to train new railway engineers or what
Mm,
have you.
mm, mm.
And that started me off on my next book project, which I'm sort of a large part of the way through researching now, but not really much into writing yet. I've only just scratched the surface on that, which is about democratization in immediate post-World War II Japan.
And the democratization was partly about dealing with fascism and preventing socialism. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, those were sort of the that was sort of the needle that they were trying to thread there. Um, Certainly, a lot of it was about getting rid of the past, moving away from the past, but there was a tremendous fear of the left, of communism,
Mm.
socialism, and so that colored a lot of the what I'm going to be looking at is sort of the space between government level changes. So, of course, there was a new constitution. There were all the political reforms, legal reforms implemented by the American occupiers through the Japanese government. And there were also grassroots movements, people starting to get involved in various ways, in ways that hadn't been possible for the previous decade or so. But in between there were organizations like Japanese National Railways, like the new national broadcasting system, NHK, well, not new, but reorganized, like an organization that was new, the PTA. There was a very strong PTA movement in post-war Japan implemented by Americans.
Parent-teacher association.
The Parent-Teacher
Sort
Association.
of,
Yeah.
model of the fantasy of white US civil society.
Yes, and they were trying to implement that in Japan. And so I wondered how were these organizations? Oh, one other one that I'm thinking about is the police at various sort of geographical levels. What were these organizations doing to take what was sort of the key word of the day, democracy? Everyone was talking about democracy, democratization. It was sort of just the thing in the first post-war decade in Japan. So what did it mean to them? And how did they try to use that word to implement ideas and actions that were going to be good for them? So for instance, in that Japanese National Railways example, they talked a lot about how, well, real democracy isn't doing these sorts of things that your union leader might be talking about, like, actually getting involved in decision making. No, that's not democracy, right? Real democracy means a spirit of service and hard work, right? Which frankly is not any definition of democracy I've ever read before. And so that's part of what made me very curious about what they were trying to do. And these are huge organizations. So the ideas about democracy that they are propagating, I feel probably had to have some kind of impact on how democracy was actually then shaped in early post-war Japan. So those are my questions, and I'm looking at materials to ask that, inspired by the world around me, where I sort of sometimes don't understand what people think democracy is.
One of the things that strikes me is that one of the world tragedies is the, in inverted commas, successful colonization and reformulation of Germany and Japan after the war by the United States and its lapdogs, in that became, in their fantasy world, a blueprint for the horrors they wrought over the next 50 years, most spectacularly in the last 20 years. The fantasy that the US is the perfect democracy, but that you can go into places that you've bombed the living hell out of and virtually destroyed and remake them in what you think of as your own image. Do you know what I mean?
I do. There were definitely efforts in that regard. There were ways in which the people who were kind of shaping the implementation went a little farther even than most Americans would. People talk about some of the more progressive elements that made it into the Japanese Constitution that are unlike anything we have in the United States. But on the other hand, the implementation was done through this very conservative government. And so it didn't always end up well. It ended up as a amalgamation or a compromise among all these various parties pushing in various directions.
The other day, I was listening to some people from Britain's Conservative Party, which is, just lost the last election in Britain this northern summer, saying that, they've been in power longer than any other Democratic Party in the world, but they'd be, in terms of the last 80 years, they get a run for their money in Japan, wouldn't they?
Yeah, the Liberal Democrats have been running Japan for most of the time since 1945. There have been a couple of brief moments since, 1955 was the consolidation of the Liberal Democratic Party. Except for those few moments of weakness, they've been pretty strong throughout.
It's an amazing achievement. So, Prof, in terms of your work, as I was saying to you before we started recording, I was lucky enough to hear you talking about your latest published book on the bullet train. I'm fortunate enough to live in Spain, which has proper mass transit and proper fast trains everywhere, which are incredibly cheap. because there are three companies that are
Mm.
competing on the same train lines. So you can go across the country at 300 kilometers an hour for $9 if
Oh,
you
lovely.
day and time. You live in a country that has the most rail track in the world and is basically living in the 19th century when it comes to these things, tragically. And and actually you're even on more or less on that track that goes from the East Coast to the West Coast, if you ever were prepared to spend the time. But this fast train, the bullet train in Japan, really revolutionized the world of transportation. And it also revolutionized, at least as I understand from your book, Japan's self-image and its image to the world. There's a moment, I think it's in the book, when you describe Charles de Gaulle, the French president, as insulting the Japanese foreign minister by calling him a transistor radio salesman. And I wondered if you could reflect for us a bit, sorry, it's a long-winded prolegomena into a question, about the significance of the train, both domestically and internationally, in the context of that sort of racist xenophobia that Japan has always experienced, but was probably worse in those days.
Yeah, sure. I should preface this by saying it was reported that Charles de Gaulle said this, but it was never verified. So I don't want to cast any aspersions on the man.
Okay.
But it almost doesn't matter whether he said it or not,
He
because
should have if he didn't.
the fact is that it was a story in Japan.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, the Charles de Gaulle said this. And this is what people think of us,
Yeah.
right? And so whether he said it or not, the fact that it was reported and that it was taken as true was really important because it made people think, it made many people think, okay, we have to really do something more than just creating great devices, than just selling awesome transistor radios and tiny television sets and even really big turbines or something. So it was both these small consumer technologies and large industrial, heavy industry that was being produced very successfully by the late 1950s even, but especially into the early 1960s. And there was a tremendous effort by the Japanese government and by various institutions like the JETRO, the Japan External Trade Organization, really thinking about not just building up Japanese trade, but really building up trust in Japan so that people would really trust Japanese products. And at the same time, they're still dealing with this idea of Japanese products as being just junk, right? Just being this 1950s knockoffs and toys. Uh, Very cheap copies of things. And so as they're beginning to get past that, people in the know, people in the electronics industry especially, were really starting to get a sense of, oh, these products are just as good as ours, and they're really cheap. And there were arguments about, well, the reason it's cheap is that they're not paying their workers anything, and so it's not fair. They're dumping or doing social dumping or kind of making excuses about it. But the ultimate impact was the same, was that they were recognizing these are really good quality products. And so there was an effort by government and semi-governmental, government-associated organizations to build on that beginning of change about what Japan was. And it was also a matter of doing so without sort of reviving wartime hatreds. And so it was kind of a balancing act, right? You wanted to say, look, we're really good at all these things. We build great products, we build great rockets, but not the kind that are going to carry missiles over to your country, right? So it's sort of like you don't want to look too scary while you're doing it. So you had to couch things in a little bit of a cultural cushion, but not so much that people start thinking about, the phrase at the time was Fujiyama geisha images, right? That it's just these sort of natural and traditional elements that made Japan interesting, but that there were contemporary exciting things like hosting the Olympics, right, which happened in summer of 1964, about a week and a half after the first bullet train started running. So it was this confluence of we can build the fastest train in the world, right? And so that's a really solid measure of Japan being the best in the world at something at the same time as they're hosting this global party, right? Where everyone's going to come from all over the world, have this wonderful, theoretically apolitical sporting event that everyone just has fun and a wonderful time, and people feel happy and grateful to Japan, and it develops all this goodwill. And at the same time, they're going to go there and they're going to see all the Seiko timekeeping devices that are in every event. And there may be, if they want to take a little trip while they're going to ride on the fastest train in the world. And as they're going, get a glimpse of Mount Fuji. So indeed, they still are getting to show off Mount Fuji, but also at the same time saying, we have built the fastest train in the world here. So that was sort of the international element. But you asked me to talk about the domestic element as well. And that is even more complicated than the international one, I think, because this was potentially something going through people's backyards. So there's one reaction which sort of bought into the promotional materials that Japanese National Railways was putting out about how this is a grand national achievement based on the incredible dedication and innovation by our fabulous engineers. But there were also people whose homes were being, what's the word I'm looking for? Who were being evicted from their homes, from their businesses, to make way for the new tracks coming through. And so those people were a little bit less happy about the situation. And so while for some people it did help kind of change their own sense of, oh, Japan is not this post-war country anymore. The famous phrase from a 1956 economic government report is the post-war is over, right? So there's a sense that we're not trying to recover anymore.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're now we have recovered, and now we can focus on sort of a higher level of production and consumption, right? So the consumption is not just for foreigners. We're not just exporting things. Also, we, the Japanese people, can sort of start thinking about not just getting our next meal, not just finding a place to live and clothing to wear, but actually maybe we ourselves could buy a transistor radio. Maybe we could get a little tiny television. And so these consumer products were really an important element as well. And so a ride on the bullet train, sort of one of those things that is, we've really made it. I can, zip down to Kyoto and take in the sights and, be back in Tokyo in time to go to work on Monday.
And Prof, jumping forward to something else, and then we'll go back to this. When I moved to the United States, I'd lived there several times, but when I moved there full-time as an adult 30 years ago, Japan was regarded as the great threat economically. The Seattle Mariners baseball team had been bought. Columbia Pictures had been bought. The car industry was being ravaged. There was terrible anti-Japanese racism in many parts of the country. Who Killed Vincent Chin? A marvelous documentary that encapsulates some of that. Now it seems to me China is sort of the new Japan. What happened to Japan? I mean, I guess around that time it suffered deflation, early 90s, and the economy kept going more or less fine, but didn't really keep zooming along as it had for decades. So what place does it hold today? This is very impressionistic, of course. Would you say in the US imaginary, what are your students saying to you about Japan?
I think my students right now are very interested in the pop culture, right? So 30 years ago, I'm told I was not yet a college professor 30 years ago, so I don't know, but my colleague says when he first started teaching that it was the business students who were coming to his classes
Yes.
and they wanted to know how do they do it, the Japanese companies, how are they so powerful? And he said now it's the people who want to be able to read their graphic novels in the original, who want to be able to watch the anime and understand it in Japanese, or to understand the context of those pop cultural products, or to understand the history that is being uh, kind of retold in, say, a video game that they're playing. And so I feel like most of my students still, it's that more in that pop culture element. They do want to know things that are going to help them understand. A lot of them play video games. A lot of them read manga and watch anime. Um, J-pop is not as popular as the Japanese pop music is not as popular as it was. More of the music, people who love music are more into Korea now. Um,
Yeah.
but
So how do you get them interested in international politics, defense, the Cold War?
That is a constant struggle for me. One of the ways that I did it was, you might call it a bait and switch, I'm not sure, but I, together with a colleague, created a new survey class, kind of intro level Japanese culture survey that we called Gods to Godzilla. And so, they're, oh, Godzilla, oh, I think I'll take this class. And they show up, but I tell them from the start, we're starting with the gods, right? We're starting with these foundation myths, and we're going to think about who wrote those myths and why, and kind of very slowly bring it up to the present day. But it's very much a Japan and class, a Japan in. So Japan and China, Japan and the West, Japan in the world. And so I take it through kind of thinking about Japan in a larger context so that they can, my goal is that they can still enjoy these cultural products, but maybe move away from some of the myths that they might be getting from those products about a, unique culture or something like that, or anyway, various historical misconceptions. And I do try to, I just try to connect it to their lives wherever possible. So bringing some history up to the present by talking about uh, debates over history in museums, talking about the Enola Gay. And so then they think, oh, atomic bombing. Oh, okay. No, that's my country, right? And so then it automatically is interesting. But they all are looking forward, I think, to the last couple of weeks of the course where we finally actually talk about Godzilla. And I let them choose what pop culture elements. We take a vote and they get to choose, okay, of Japan in the world today, what do you want to learn about? And
And
anime is almost always on the list.
they all choose Madame Butterfly and Puccini.
I'm shocked that they do not. They
Now,
should.
do you fill their minds with 1853 and the Shogun dynasty and all that sort of opening? Do they? What do
Yeah,
they
that's
do?
absolutely in there. So the second section of the course, I mean, I do have an entire course on the Tokugawa period, well, sort of
Hmm.
just before and just after. But in that survey, in my survey classes, well, in the one I was just telling you about, at any rate, I do have one of my second of four sections is about the samurai. Because that's another thing that students do want to know about. They know the samurai, they've heard of samurai and Bushido and even ninjas. I don't teach about ninjas, but they want to know about that element in their video game with all these samurai. They want to kind of learn more about that. Um, and so, yeah, have a section about that, and that the transition from that section to the Japan and the West is, of course, Commodore Perry. So
And
that comes in.
I'm thinking about, I don't know if you know this book, but Jay McInerney's book, Ransom.
I have not read that, so on my list.
It might be an interesting one. It's from about close to 30 years ago. And it's part of the US fetish for Japan and ideas of aesthetic self-formation through militarism, where you get a gringo who moves, well, this is my memory, it's really a long time since I read it. You get a gringo who moves to Japan, set in, the 1980s or 1990s, and wants to learn about everything to do with being a gladiator, and imbibes a lot of it, and it ends rather gorily. It's incredibly interesting. And I don't imagine that young people read Jay McInerney anymore. He's probably not an important name for them. But it's really interesting, as a person who's not an expert on any of these things, to look at in terms of the way in which, and it's not just true of the United States, it's true of many countries, there's a fascination with exactly what you mentioned earlier, getting back to your second book, which is the image of Japan as both pre-fascist and post-fascist and not fascist. So the pre-fascist bit is this long trajectory of an extraordinary set of cultures. And then there's this extraordinarily rapid modernization, which occurs in part under fascism, but there's an epistemological break. And then it reemerges in the 50s. So I'm fascinated, just about the attitude that people in inverted commas, the West, have to Japan historically in terms of this oscillation.
Yeah, I also am fascinated with that, which is why I do write a lot about it. My research is mostly on the 20th century, but in my teaching, I have another class called Japan and the World, modern Japan and the World, and so we kind of start with the period of the 1825 isolation. Now I'm forgetting the phrase for it, but the isolation rule that said, okay, fire at any ships that come along, which was in some ways the beginning of the whole idea of Tokugawa Japan is completely isolated, right? Even though because it wasn't, right? But this 1825 moment of, oh gosh, there are all these new ships showing up. Just shoot at them. And so I think we often start there because then the initial idea is of the Japanese government or Japan as this one sort of entity, imagined entity, as this hostile, Melville said that double-bolted land Japan, right? Like it's lawless. That's also from Melville. It's lawless, it's double-bolted, it's shut up, we can't get into it, right? So that's 1850, Moby Dick, right? Yeah. And that was the attitude that inspired the government to say, okay, Perry, go ahead. We gotta have like a safe landing spot to even, if we get caught up in a storm, we have to not get arrested if we end up on Japanese shores, make some kind of deal with them, right? And so that's the first, how did, from Japan as lawless and scary, the new Japanese government that came into power in 1868, they were like, we got to change that because they just slapped these horrible treaties on us where they have extraterritoriality. They've set the tariffs. They're, bossing us around like crazy. And we want to renegotiate these tariffs. And they just said no, flat out. So how do we convince them that we've changed? And that inspired a lot of the policymaking of the late 19th century, but it's a process. So what I teach my students is the process of changing the world's opinion and what that meant for the governance of Japan. And there is this flip-flop, right? And they're fighting for American opinion. We were talking about sports earlier. It happens through sports in the early 20th century that there are these uh, baseball connections where actually not just California, college teams, I think maybe there's a Chicago baseball team that goes over to Japan. There are Japanese teams coming over to the US and Americans are impressed that they play baseball really well. And that's just one tiny way of changing some people's opinions. Of course, bombing Pearl Harbor really ruined any efforts that they had
Well, except now the
made.
greatest baseballer of all time is Japanese, right? Looks like
Yeah,
it.
wow. I mean, how many Japanese boys are named Shohei right now?
So, for a lot of people, 1941, 1942 represent a massive break. 41, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. 42, the fall of Singapore. Both of which, in an ironic way, confirm the irrelevance of the British in the region, despite their former sea power, something the Japanese already knew and the Americans already knew. But US hegemony in that part of the world, challenged by the Japanese, now by the Chinese, has always been powerful, really for well over a century. And it's hard to see that ever changing when you've got so many countries, including Japan, relying on it as a bulwark against China.
Yeah.
And whereas NATO has become something controversial for the party of darkness, stupidity, and bigotry, aka the Republican Party, no one is prepared, as far as I can see, in US politics, to say, why aren't we getting paid vast billions of dollars by the Koreans, the Vietnamese, the Taiwanese, the Japanese for saving them from the evil empire? Yeah. And that hegemony seems ongoing, supported locally, apart from some issues, with occupation, and bipartisan within the US. Is that right, or have I misunderstood things?
Well, the present day is well outside of my area of expertise and research, but certainly it does seem hard to imagine how the US-Japan partnership would break down. I can imagine, I don't know, if the PRC decided to invade Taiwan, would the US really go to war to help them? That's something I don't know, but it seems hard to imagine. Japan, there's that relationship is too close and too, in many ways, mutually beneficial. I mean, there are plenty of Japanese people who would love to get rid of the American bases, but for the people in power, from their point of view, mutually beneficial, that I don't imagine it going away any time in the foreseeable future, right?
Yeah.
The nuclear umbrella, as it were, is something that is, can I say essential? It seems essential, or it's perceived as essential at any rate.
Policymakers, yeah. And in terms of Japan's history as a colonial power, felt very keenly, I think, still in China and Korea. How has that played out since the war in particular, would you say?
Well, in different ways, in different places, it's become much more difficult in recent years. It was something that was not much discussed in global level international relations until maybe I don't know, was it 1970s or something? So a lot of the territorial disputes that are ongoing, did not become disputes until, frankly, the resources were discovered, oil was discovered, and then suddenly more different countries are interested in controlling the
Yeah.
territories that give them sovereignty over those areas. So that's part of it, but also education changed in Korea, in China, and there was a much stronger emphasis on the horrors of Japanese uh, occupation. And so that creates more anger in those countries. At the same time, there are major problems with Japanese education where there is a lot of kind of whitewashing or use of euphemisms. Oh, the Japanese army advanced, it didn't invade, right? And so that's a subtle difference, perhaps, but it's a very meaningful one. The
Mm.
denial by very powerful people of the comfort women system, the system of sexual slavery, implemented by the Japanese military. And so all of these cause tremendous pain among people who feel that their experience or their country people's experiences are being ignored or discounted or minimized or denied. And so I feel that the history problems, the contemporary impact of colonial history just keeps getting worse because of the conflicting directions of education in these countries,
Yeah.
right? And so I feel like any progress that gets made, inevitably some Japanese politician says, "Oh, well, that didn't happen," and why do you say that, right? And so yeah, it continues to be a real problem.
Real issue. And
Yeah,
it's high school textbooks where a lot of this gets played out.
yes,
A bit like what's happening in the US over slavery.
yes, yes,
Yes?
absolutely.
Reasonable analogy? Yeah.
I see a lot of analogies when I read the news. Now, I don't have a child in high school anymore, so I'm not paying as close attention as I used to. But when I read in the news about proposed changes in, say, Florida or Texas, apparently is the national leader. Whatever they do in Texas, every textbook company wants to do that because that's one of the biggest markets, right? And so when I read about what they're writing in their textbooks or what they're not writing in their textbooks or what they're calling for, I think, oh gosh, that sounds painfully familiar to what I hear from the Japanese context of trying to have, as the phrase in Japan is, a history that we can feel proud of, right? That we're not ashamed of. And there's no such thing. Everyone has something in their national. Every country has something in their past that is bad, right? So why should we pretend to be 100% good? Because then when you learn about the bad things other countries have done historically, you think, well, they are bad people and we are good people. That's just not a healthy
Yeah.
way for a citizenry
But
to think.
last summer, Prof, I was at a fairly big conference in Norway, and quite a lot of the head honchos, plus myself as the token insignificant figure, went out for dinner. And I asked people to nominate what they regarded as the worst imperial power of all. And I was pleased to see that everybody from all over the world nominated Britain entirely correctly. Because, of course, if you make things limited to the war, and in the German and Japanese case, the immediate period prior, in concentrated ways, it's appalling, but it's nothing compared to centuries of European decimation of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Anyway, I wanted to get back to betraying, if I may, Prof.
Mhm.
I've distracted you
Always
with
happy to talk
these
about trains.
other questions. And it was such an amazing thing in the 60s. I mean, and of course, it happened at the same time as satellite television was really beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And Japan was a pioneer in these fields. now that fast trains are common in places like France and so on, and in other parts of Japan, are they still innovating? Are exciting things still happening? What are they up to now?
Yeah, well, there's this kind of contest to have the fastest train in the world. So there, it was very, it was very exciting, as I said, in the 1960s, and induced a lot of pride, national pride, to have the fastest train in the world. But now the fastest train in the world is, I think it's in China, uh, uh, and there is a plan that has been on, been in progress for a very long time in Japan to have a new maglev train um, from Tokyo to Osaka in oh gosh, now I forget it's an hour and a half, I forget, but it doesn't matter because it's stuck. It got well, before I say it got stuck, so I think there's this uh, Chinese Japanese competition in that in some ways Japan cannot win because China will always have more, right? They have I think the longest stretch of high-speed rail in the world, right? Well, if you wanted to get that much high-speed rail in Japan, you'd cover the entire country. There wouldn't be room for anything
Yeah.
else, right? It's just a small country. But I guess there is a sense that they could have the fastest train again, and it was supposed to debut in 2027. That has been pushed back significantly now. Um, I was really hoping, frankly, that they would open it in 2024 because then I could write an article about the bullet train in 64 with the Olympics and the maglev in 24 with the Olympics. I mean, 2020 with the Olympics. But yeah, that didn't work out. So it's 2027, but now it isn't. I think it's maybe 2030 something now because, well, there were various difficulties, but one really interesting difficulty, interesting to me at any rate, in comparison to the 1964 case, is that there was one prefecture, Shizuoka Prefecture, where the maglev train was not going to stop. It was just going to run through a lot of tunnels. And so they were not going to get the benefit of having a maglev stop in the prefecture, but they were getting a tremendous risk of environmental damage. And there were great fears, and these fears were voiced a lot in the late 50s, early 1960s as well, that the tunneling for high-speed rail was going to hit some underwater aquifers and caused tremendous damage to the tea and orange industries there. And so these are very important industries for Shizuoka Prefecture, and people were really worried. They were worried when the bullet train was being built, but their protests were more or less ignored. The protests had more oomph in the present day, in part, I think, because the government of Shizuoka did not have an interest in having the maglev, right? They weren't getting the benefit of having a stop, so that was different. Also, there's a much greater environmental awareness. In the 1960s in Japan, that really wasn't very strong. It was beginning to be recognized, but it wasn't really until the 1970s that people really became aware of pollution and other environmental problems in Japan. And so the sense of the importance of the environment is greater. And I think social media makes it much more easy for people to know what's going on, to communicate it to people. A lot of the people who were against the bullet train in the 1960s didn't know what was happening until all the plans had been made and people are showing up to survey the land, right? And so then they're like, wait, what's happening? Too late. Whereas now people find out as soon as decisions are made or being discussed, even they're finding out. And so it's easier to organize. And finally, again, I mean, digital media and telecommunications is changing things after the pandemic and people switching to this venue right now, doing a lot of things on Zoom, and you don't have to necessarily go all the way to Tokyo for your meeting with someone. You can just do a Zoom call, and it's essentially face to face. And so people are wondering, do we need a maglev train? Right? Is what we have good enough? And so there's less pressure for it than there was in the past. And so with all of these together, the governor of Shizuoka Prefecture was blocking construction in his prefecture for a long time. And I was really wondering what would happen, but finally, due to some scandal about some comments that he made publicly, he resigned, and a new governor has been elected who is in favor of working with JR to Japanese Rail to bring the maglev through. So it looks like maybe it can happen.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a great story. And I wanted to get back to your first book, which I think was your doctorate. I think
yes.
In the prefatory remarks, which is the period from the mid-30s through to 64. So it's the period during the Depression, in the run into the war, the epoch of the greater Southeast Asian co-prosperity sphere, a wonderful expression that nobody uses anymore because it signified something not very nice. Through the horror of the war, the post-war re-emergence, and then up to the fast train, the bullet train, and the Olympics, the Summer Olympics. And this is about the popular, but it's also about the popular culture and reintegration into the world for the second half. And then the first half is the rise of nationalism in a way that gets damned because it melds with fascism.
Well, yes, but in the context of internationalism and strong efforts to integrate in the world. So what I really wanted to get at, and again, this was a project that was very much influenced by the world around me, which was I went to Japan in September of 2001 to do my dissertation research, or August 2001, and then watched the World Trade Center crumble on television from over there. And it was educational and instructive to be away from the United States while all this was happening, and to some extent watching it from the outside and listening to the rhetoric that was coming out of the Bush administration at the time, that was being used to justify violence, aggression, and realizing that this disconnect of using the rhetoric of international cooperation to fight a war was exactly what I was reading about in my materials that I was gathering about the Japan quitting the League of Nations in 1933. And in addition, this was the year of 2002 was the year of the co-hosted World Cup by Japan and Korea. And so every day I was reading in the news, this is going to be amazing for Japanese-South Korean relations, and this is introducing Korea to the world, and this is going to be a tremendous boon for Japan's international relations because everybody's going to just love Japan after this. And then I would go to the archives and read newspaper articles about the 1940 Tokyo Olympics, which the Olympics were supposed to be in Tokyo in 1940, but of course they had to cancel it because they were fighting a war. They canceled it in 1938. But from 1936, when Japan won the right to host, when Tokyo won the right to host the Olympics, until they were canceled in summer of 1938, there were stories everywhere about how great this was going to be for Japanese international relations, going to introduce Japan to the world. Everyone's going to be grateful to Japan for this great event. They're going to go and be really impressed with Tokyo as a world capital, right? And it is just as if people were copying the same article and publishing it about the World Cup in 2002, as they had said in 1937 or whatever. And so I thought, oh, okay, there are some things that have never changed. They're still happening. So I want to know, how did these things get set in the 1930s after Japan quit the League of Nations? So I started my book with an ending, right? With Japan leaving the League of Nations and saying, forget it, we're not going to be part of this, which the literature at the time always depicted as the beginning of isolation. But I said there were all these people who had been involved in the League of Nations, or who were in the foreign ministry, or who had been involved in trying to host the Olympics, who were really set on continuing some kind of international cooperation, on continuing to be part of the world. So even people who had been part of the League of Nations said, okay, we're losing the League of Nations, but we can't give up on the world. What can we do? They formed an organization to promote Japanese culture and have cultural relations with other parts of the world. So in a way, trying to replace the League's intellectual cooperation committee. So yeah, that ultimately none of these efforts at continuing cooperation were able to withstand the sort of counter forces for autarky and aggression and war. But you mentioned my doctorate. That was the entire doctorate. And then after that, I said, okay, let's see what happened in the post-war. And I added the post-war on for the book to see, okay, how did these ideas continue? How did the experience of trying to continue to be internationalist, to be engaged with the world during this very inhospitable period, how did that shape post-war Japanese international relations?
And I think it is incredibly important, particularly when dealing with these big blocks of history that in some ways emblematize our epoch, even if they're not talked about all that much now, to allow for the warp and woof of contradiction and difference, as opposed to an essentialist version of history, which leads to all sorts of unfortunate things. I remember very vividly in 2001, I was living in New York. I saw people jumping from the towers. Immediately, this was turned into Pearl Harbor. We have been betrayed. We are good people. And the same level of mad lack of self-reflexivity that major powers indulge in all the time. Mm-hmm. But interesting in terms of the notion in the United States of somehow or other being morally pure by contrast with all others. And this having been done in by the Japanese in 1941 and being done in by, well, really the Saudis, but apparently the Afghans in 2001. Identification of an evil force that doesn't understand our essential goodness. I found that to be inordinately powerful. And you get it, I mean, all, as you were saying, all these big countries do it, and little ones do as well. But it was very striking the way in which Pearl Harbor was invoked again and again in this form. And that makes it very hard to recognize that there are always going to be countervailing forces operating within the other, whatever the other might be, just as people were loath to recognize that various elements of Al-Qaeda had been the creatures of the CIA, and they were, our bastards. The Taliban were our bastards against the Soviets in our smart-ass notion of how we'll create a Vietnamese quagmire for those bastards. You know what I mean? So I think it is,
yeah.
I do think that 41 and 42 not only mark the end of the remnants of British hegemony, the consolidation of Japanese and US hegemony, and then, of course, the takeover by the United States, but also this epistemological rupture about the United States as an outward-looking country that is pure, that gets monstered in 41 and again 60 years later.
Mm.
enormously powerful. Anyway, enough of that kind of grandstanding. Tell us more about these internationalist tendencies at a time when Japan had gone back to a century earlier in a certain sense.
In a certain sense, right? In the most official sense, if you think about the League of Nations as uh, the foremost organization for international cooperation, right? To quit it is saying, all right, we're giving up on the world. There were other elements, economic, in terms of economic cooperation and arms negotiations in which the Japanese government was backing out of cooperation. Even within the League of Nations, the Japanese government continued to cooperate with the League of Nations in various ways, sending reports and cooperating with various auxiliary UN, not UN, sorry, League of Nations bodies until 1938, actually. They were still trying to cooperate with what they called the non-political elements of the League. So things related to health and welfare and labor and the like.
Right.
So there was that. But in addition, I mentioned this organization that was begun to sort of take the place of the International Cooperation Committee. So this is something that's called the English, it was usually translated into English as the Society for International Cultural Relations. It's called the KBS, usually, which is short for the Japanese title, Kokusai Bunka Shinkokai, which doesn't literally mean society, but that's how they translated it. The literal translation is International Culture Promotion Society. So it's much more about promoting than exchanging in the Japanese, which I think is telling because it ends up that's eventually mainly what they do, more promoting than exchanging. But initially it really was like, hey, let's bring people over to Japan, let's send scholars abroad. We'll learn about them, they'll learn about us. It'll be this lovely exchange. Gradually, as the war intensified, the funding of the organization came more and more from the government. Greater percentage from the government. Also, the organization came under the control of a branch of the cabinet, essentially, that was in control of information. And so it became much more an arm of the government almost by really over the course of the late 1930s. So by the beginning of war with the United States, this was very firmly a propaganda arm of the government. And so it's really not kind of learning about the world's culture and trying to have cultural engagement with the world, but really let's teach people Japanese and we can build the co-prosperity sphere. We can build a cultural co-prosperity sphere by making sure everyone can speak Japanese and everybody sees important films like Japan's Naval Strength, right? So they were making films like that and sending them to Southeast Asia and the like. So you can kind of see how that effort gets sort of hijacked. But the organization picks up the pieces after defeat and gets back to business and tries again to have a more peace-oriented cultural exchange.
And some of the same people are involved, aren't they?
Yes, yeah. Some of the people from the the Intellectual Cooperation Committee of the League of Nations are involved in the founding of the KBS. With the sort of move into the government, some of the top people step back and say, I'm not going to do this anymore, but pretty much the personnel remains the same. And then, into the post-war period, they get a new address. But other than that, a lot of it stays the same. The organization disbanded in 1972, and it did not become the Japan Foundation, but the Japan Foundation kind of picked up a lot of its activities. And, if you go to the Japan Foundation Library, it has the archive, the sort of boxes of materials of the KBS there in their library. So there's some kind of connection, but others have drawn it more clearly than I have. I didn't really look into that. I stopped my research in 1964. That's one example, but you can really see, it's perhaps more clear in the lead up to the 1964 Olympics, where you get the whole idea of hosting the Olympics is picked up again and said, okay, now we're going to do this. We tried in 1940, we didn't manage. Now let's host the Olympics, and people will really understand Japan. They'll know us, and therefore they'll like us. And it wasn't to introduce militarily strong Japan. It was to introduce this industrial, but culturally admirable Japan that wouldn't be just a transistor salesman, but something more than that.
And where's the left in all of this, as broadly construed?
The left was trying to make its voice heard with varying levels of success. So the Olympics are an interesting example because that was a place where almost anyone could pick up that rhetoric and run with it. And the Olympics, because the Olympic movement claims to be apolitical, it leaves this really big open space for anyone to put their own politics into it, because it's a lie. It's not a lie. That's a mean word to use. It's maybe misdirection to say it's apolitical, because what they mean by apolitical is that we're not going to kind of choose any side in any national context, but it's promoting internationalism. That's a politics. And it's promoting world peace, right? And so anyone who can say, yeah, we are on the side of internationalism and world peace, can take that Olympic rhetoric for themselves. But as I showed in the first half of the book, anyone can use the rhetoric of internationalism. You mentioned the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. That sounds a lot like internationalism, right? Let's work together for all of our prosperity, right? Let's not mention the part where we are invading you and controlling your government. But at any rate, so the Olympic rhetoric of peace and what was the phrase? A festival of amity and peace. This is a quote from the, I think, 1960 Olympic Charter. The Japanese government took that up and said, we are going to have a festival of amity and peace and amity, whatever. And the people on the left said, okay, how can we have a festival of peace and amity when you have just signed an agreement with the world's foremost imperialist power to go and, help them with et cetera, right? So taking this idea of a festival of peace and amity and saying, we can't do that until we reject American imperialism, until we reject the partnership with the militarist United States, until we reject the rebuilding of our military. Because this is the time when the Japanese military was rebuilding very heartily with American backing. And so that the leftists were trying to take advantage of that Olympic rhetoric in the same way that some leftists tried to in the 1930s. So the 1930s are a time when leftists can almost not say anything. After the 1925 Peace Preservation Law, which said you're not allowed to publish anything that denies the system of public property, private property. Anyone who's saying anything that sounds communist or socialist can be thrown in jail, or fined, or have their publications pulled. It created a tremendous silence on the left, and it got more and more strict over the course of the 1930s. And so it became almost impossible to publish anything that openly advocated communism, socialism, or any other kind of anti-government, anti-militarist stance. But even in 1936, a prominent communist published a critique of government policy by couching it as a critique of Olympic policy and saying, like, how can you be going on and on about how we should clean up the city for the Olympics when if you just cleaned up, now I'm not going to be able to remember the exact quote, but it was basically saying if you gave us political freedoms, we would have the pride to keep our own place clean. You wouldn't have to tell us to do it, right? And so it's essentially a critique of censorship. He didn't get arrested for that one, and it got published. So he managed. He got arrested for other things. Yeah, so in both moments, you see the left trying to take that rhetoric. It was not the predominant view by any stretch of the imagination in either moment. The sort of government view of let's have a festival of peace and amity was by far the most, the loudest.
Prof, I've got one more question for you, if I may. And after that, I'd like to invite you to add anything you may wish that could involve going back over something we've discussed, or it might be new material. Does that sound okay as a means of bringing
Sounds great.
Conclusion? So my last question, now that I've done about the left, I wanted to ask about gender and race. Gender in part because in the occupation of China, institutionalized rape was enormously important. In fact, the League's report on that becomes, in the epistemology of feminist history, immensely significant for the massive testimony to this. So I want to ask about gender issues, in part in that context, and then racism in terms of the way Japanese culture is viewing others and the way that it is viewed. Because we've seen from back in the 19th century, massive exploitation of the Japanese in the United States and intense racism within the United States, the horror, of course, of internment, the internment, as supported by Governor Warren and FDR in California during the war, and a set of racial epithets that continued for decades. So could you talk to us about those gender issues, not just in terms of the so-called rape of Nanjing, but more generally, and also about this question of othering the rest of the world and the rest of the world othering Japan?
Absolutely. I'm probably not the best person to talk about gender. It's not something that I have worked on in any kind of direct way. In terms of colonial history and wartime history, clearly it, you mentioned institutionalized rape. That clearly is such a tremendous impediment to Japan's relations with its former colonies and former occupied territories, former enemies. The potential for getting past that, for repairing that damage, if you can call it damage, it's so much more than damage, for somehow rebuilding that connection or building some kind of relationship. Again, this is moving a bit uncomfortably outside my area of expertise, but I do feel like it can't be unrelated to sexism within Japan today. This is still a very, very sexist society, very strongly patriarchal society, very few women in positions of power, whether in government or in the private world. the ideas about women's roles and men's roles in society are still very seemingly old-fashioned, I think. Um, and so it seems to me there must be some kind of a connection. At the same time, if you think about, I was mentioning, there are many people who would be glad to be rid of the United States and American bases. I mean, part of the problem with American bases is that young soldiers, if they commit crimes, one of which is raping a Japanese woman in Okinawa, that is something that, yeah, causes tremendous international problems. And so it seems like people would make some kind of a connection there, but yeah, as you pointed out, it's very hard to see your own country as one of the other side, right? In these historical questions. The question of race, I think, is one that is a one that has mattered for Japanese leaders and people trying to play a role in Japan's international relations, really from the middle of the 19th century right up to the present day. It's less intense maybe than it was in the past, but there is racism in both directions, of course, right? From one side not trusting the other to sort of specific ideas of how they would be, that then get reinforced by narratives about war, right? The whole idea of the Pearl Harbor attack as being something sneaky, right? And then you can hear that rhetoric. And John Dower has written very powerfully on this kind of resurgence of wartime rhetoric in the 1980s, in this moment of Japanese economic dominance, this idea of the Japanese being sneaky really came into the rhetoric that I was mentioning earlier of electronics, the electronics industry being concerned about these cheap semiconductors coming in and competing with theirs, that they were sneaking in by paying their workers so little, that this is underhanded. And so that rhetoric of the sneaky, they're weaker. But why are we scared of them if they're weaker? Oh, because they're not playing fair, right? And so that rhetoric comes back and it gets connected to race in ways that are a little bit painful to look at today, so I mentioned Dower's treatment of this. He looks at political cartoons from the 1940s, early 1940s, and late 1940s from the occupation as well, and then again from the late 1980s, early 1990s, and it's the same sort of simian imagery or vermin, but also the same kind of Superman imagery. So you get these Superman robotic samurai taking over Wall Street in the 1980s, right? But it's robotic, right? It's still not human. Just as you had in the 1940s a super ape labeled Japan maybe eating with a gun labeled civilization to its head. I'm having trouble remembering the details, but it was this not human, but superhuman. So less than human or superhuman, but never just human. And so that racist element really comes in very strongly. And so that was the balancing act that I was referring to in the 1964 moment. One of the things I wrote about a little bit in my book, but I wrote an article covering it in more more closely in the journal Technology and Culture, the 1964-65 New York World's Fair. It was this moment of, we want to show Americans the amazing progress we've done in the last 100 years since essentially Perry came. So they called it From Feudalism to the Edge of Space, right? 100 years. And so they didn't want to do the typical World's Fair, like, oh, here are some cultural products and here's our industry. They said, we're going to put all the cultural stuff in the background and let's just have, you walk in and you see a rocket, and it's a weather rocket, and it said rockets for peaceful purposes. But people missed the peaceful purposes, and on their exit interviews said, "Oh, that's really frightening. It's a scary rocket. Is this a military thing? Oh, was this the Soviet pavilion? Like I see a ICBM or something." They didn't say that literally, but they did. Some people did make a mistake and say, "Was this the Soviet pavilion? Like I saw a rocket." And so they were scared of the rocket, and so they ended up moving the rocket to the back because they didn't want to have that be the impression. They instead put a car there, and people just laughed. "Oh my God, a Japanese car, how funny." Well, for then it was, but so yeah, trying to get past that racist view of the Japanese as sneaky or superhuman, but just not human quite, and introduce a human element was a challenge. And the other thing that they found on the exit interviews from the Japanese pavilion at the World's Fair was that people said, "Oh, I wanted to see more of that, the cherry blossoms and things, right? I wanted to see more of that," as they put it, Oriental culture. And so it kind of was cutting against the effort to move away from that, but they put in a bunch of that for the second season and added pictures of cherry blossoms and the like.
I'm still running through my mind the way music does when you don't want it to. It's a small world song from the World's Fair.
Uh-huh.
It's a small world after all.
Indeed, yeah.
It's not appalling. And that means that if I'm not careful, when I go to bed in a couple of hours, I'll be dreaming about the theme song to Flipper. This is all.
Oh gosh. I'm sorry if that's my fault,
No, it's not your fault, but I'm triggered by It's a Small, Small World. So, Prof, that is amazingly insightful and interesting. Thank you. Are there things you'd like to add, as I say, that we haven't discussed, or perhaps to things that we have discussed?
I guess one of the few things I haven't really discussed is that, well, I focused a lot on cultural internationalism, and I think in part because, for whatever reason, I talked a lot about the cultural internationalism, but there were also other efforts to continue this internationalist activity in terms of as well, I did mention trying to continue cooperation with the League of Nations that fed into that immediately after the war. As soon as the United Nations was formed, there were people in Japan who were like, we got to join that organization, right? And there was a very strong support in the foreign policy sort of community to joining the UN after the war in Japan. The Japanese government very much got right into that and applied for membership as soon as they can. It took them a while to get in, but also regional efforts. So the turn, I mentioned we talked about the idea of the co-prosperity sphere. Oddly, yes, indeed, nobody uses that word anymore, but the idea is still very powerful and is something that came up at the Bandung conference in Japanese proposals for economic cooperation. They talked about co-prosperity, right? And working together to prosper together. So the ideas, although the rhetoric was poisoned, the phrase was poisoned, there were efforts to kind of keep that going. And I think it was Richard Wright, perhaps in his book on the Bandung conference, said about the Japanese presence at the conference, this means Japan won the war. right? They managed to create their co-prosperity sphere. So a lot of these things that we see in the war, after the war, are things that really do continue today in Japanese enthusiasm for the United Nations, in various regional efforts. The bullet train, as I said, happening today. So you asked me earlier, how do I get my students interested in these historical aspects and political history? And you can almost always connect things one way or another, bring things up to date, and well, certainly in part that's the way, because as I said, the way I get interested in something to do research on in the first place is because I'm seeing it around me. That makes it very easy to kind of connect things to the present day, when the whole reason I got curious about it in the first place was trying to understand what is going on.
Beautifully put. That could be a great motto for academic research.
What is going on?
So I love the two books. I
Thank
came
you.
to them recently when I discovered your work, and they're both fantastic. You have a great writing style. You interlace political, economic, and cultural, textual questions, primary materials, all sorts of things are going on in your work, but it's all woven together beautifully. And
Thank you very much.
so I've learned a lot today talking to you, and I look forward to reading the new book when you find the time to write it and when it comes out.
I'm working on it.
Great. Cheers.
Thank you.